Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to the CSJ and Prison Reform Trust for organising this event, and thank you to all of you for coming. Well, we are, as Ed said, heading now into the final days of this Parliament. I've not lost track of which day is 100 days till the general election, but it's an indicator of just how soon it all is. And it's been a long, challenging Parliament with many big issues to face, financial challenges, large and difficult problems around social challenges, and some big reforms that we have pushed through in our welfare system, our education system, and our justice system. And against that backdrop of what was a dire economic situation in 2010, the reality was not reforming was simply not an option. That was certainly true in the Ministry of Justice. So during the last 5 years, during the 5 years between that period in 2010 and the financial year that's about to start, the Parliament's budget will have fallen by around a third. And that is the context in which we have sought to deliver positive change, to keep the system going, and to make sure we have proper justice and a proper approach in our prisons and our rehabilitation system. And of course, we faced real challenges that needed to be solved, like the persistent levels of reoffending, like the fact that after 12 months, prisoners got no support when they left, as Ed said. No one in government would ever have claimed these reforms were the easy option. In many areas, including my own, we've faced criticism for our choices. And what I'd like to do this morning is explain to you why we set out on the path we did with regards to prison policy. I want to address how we'll deal with some of the pressures the system is facing now. And I want to outline where I think our future lies in delivering more effective rehabilitation for offenders. And of course, this is a very exciting week, because this time next week, the rehabilitation reforms and probation begin to take effect, and I believe they'll make a big difference. Let me start with a basic principle. I believe that sending people to prison is necessary. It's the right thing to do. I believe in locking up people who commit crimes. I don't agree with those who say we send too many people to prison. And there's one very good reason for that. Almost everyone who ends up in our prisons has already committed multiple offences. If anything, you can argue we sometimes wait too long before we send someone to prison for the first time. By the time they end up there, they've become embedded in a life of crime. Some people also make the argument that we should be looking across the water to the United States and the current direction of travel in their thinking on what makes an effective criminal justice system. The fact of the matter is, though, that in the US, a much higher proportion of offenders are sent to prison for crimes that in this country would receive only a community sentence. So although the US may indeed be working very hard at present to bring down their prison population, and in some places leading away from a greater diversion, leading towards a greater diversion away from incarceration, the fact of the matter is they are starting from a much higher base than us. And their policy choices do not, in my view, have a straight and direct read across to what we're doing in this country. Now I appreciate that that is a message that some may not want to hear. And yes, I do believe in prison. It protects society from those who would harm it. It takes persistent offenders off the streets. It gives a respite to the communities that they blight. It should always be there as a punishment and a deterrent. Now that's the side of the story that usually gets waved around by left-wing critics of what I'm doing, claim that I'm nothing but an reconstructed, hang-on-the-flog sort of conservative. Actually, that is, I believe, really one part of a much more complex story. And the other one is that those same critics conveniently seem to forget sometimes and choose to ignore the real purpose of what we're doing. When I became Justice Secretary 2.5 years ago, it was blindingly obvious to me from the start that just doing more of the same wasn't going to work. But of course, there's some good news around. Crime is down. There are fewer first-time entrants to the criminal justice system. But neither of those things make up for the fact that we have a persistent, hardcore of offenders going round and round the system, leaving a trail of victims in their wake. That is the other side of the coin. Yes, prison works in many respects. The system does not work well enough, and we have to make it work better. We have to be ruthlessly realistic about what locking people up achieves. Leaving them to languish inside, and then particularly just letting them out again without any thought about what happens to them after they leave the prison gate is not going to get us very far at all. I'd say the situation where we've been releasing short-term offenders onto our streets with no support at all has been completely defensible. And I'm really pleased that that is now changing. But those who argue that the solution is no short sentences are, in my view, completely wrong. Most of those who end up in prison have been through community sentences already. They've been under the supervision of probation already. If those sentences, doing that simply prevented reoffending, those people wouldn't be arriving in prison in the first place. So whilst I believe community sentences have an important role to play, and in many respects are successful, they are not the solution to the challenge of short-term prison sentences. And I do believe, and I believe from the start, that work does need to start with offenders in prison. We need to equip them with the skills they need to find gainful employment upon release. And for the same reason, education programs inside our prisons are key. For many, formal education will have been patchy at best, and we need to help plug those gaps even in the levels of basic literacy and numeracy, which all of us here in this room have taken for granted. Now, I'm a huge believer, as my predecessor Ken Clark was, in doing as much as we can to get that rehabilitation of offenders inside the prison gates. He made a great start in ensuring the amount of work and education in prisons increased, and that work has continued under my leadership. We both made inroads in the right direction. The number of prisoners participating in learning continues to increase year on year, and last year over 14 million hours of work in prison were fulfilled. Thanks to the commitment of governors and staff and the support of businesses both national and local, prisons all over the country, there are excellent examples of programs for offenders both gaining more professional skills, vitally important personal skills such as teamwork and commitment, building up practical work experience that can equip them for a job after they leave. Many prominent firms taking on offenders after they've left who they've worked with inside prisons. The more we can do, that better. And we continue to work to do so. There are constraints. Big Victorian prisons without an awful lot of flexibility in the real estate makes life more difficult. But there is really good work being done. Of course, there's more to do. And the staff shortages of recent months, about which more in a moment, have slowed progress in some prisons. But there is no doubt in the strategy. It is why we're in the process, for example, of doubling the amount of education in our youth estate, so that effectively young people in detention are getting something more akin to a full week of college work, rather than the amount they've been getting previously. And it's also why we're seeking to create a new kind of institution in the youth secure estate, the secure college. I want fewer institutions for teenagers that are basically just prisons with iron bars. I want an environment that is closer to an education institution with a greater focus on skill building. I believe that is a better environment to put people into. And yet many people are virulently opposed to this approach. They want small local institutions instead. I tell them this: it is both unrealistic and unaffordable. Small units are not proven to work. The nearest we have to them are the secure children's homes. Their reoffending rate is as bad as any other institution, worse than most prisons, as bad as any other form of youth detention institution. And they cost more than £200,000 per year per place. We could not possibly, nor could any government, afford to extend them across the youth estate. So my message to those opposed to the secure college is this: it is a straightforward choice. We can keep the status quo with prisons, big iron bar doors, an environment I don't believe is best suited to young offenders. Or we can try and change things. Create an educational environment with a broad curriculum, which is crucial, because the secure college is designed to have a broad curriculum meeting different skill needs to try to do things better. I know which option I prefer. However, we still have that huge hole in support provided to people post-prison. Those with the highest reoffending rates are those who have served the shortest sentences. And if they were wonder really, all we did was release them onto the streets with £46 in their pocket, nowhere to go, little or no support at all post-prison. All compounded by the lack of continuity in any support you might have been receiving inside for issues such as drug or alcohol dependency. Now, as most of you in this room will know, hopefully, all of that is due to imminently change, so that there will be, from this time next week, a system of through-the-gate support and mentoring with a mix of private, voluntary, mutual and public organisations working together, all involved in helping make sure that offenders turn away from a life of crime. something that is more akin to support and mentoring than simply formulating supervision. Reforms are designed to create the innovative environment in which that can happen. But I'm not going to talk at great length about probation reforms today, but I wanted to touch on what happens in prisons alongside those reforms, because these are reforms not just simply about the way things work post-prison. We're also reshaping our prison system as well, with the creation of what's going to be known as resettlement prisons. What's going to happen is that in the future, most prisoners will spend the last few months of their sentences, or the whole sentence is a short sentence, in a prison, in the area they'll be living in when they're released. And the purpose of that is to ensure that in preparing for their release, it is the same people, the same organisations who will be working with them as they pass through the prison gate, and for the 12-month period beyond that is the other picture, which is the 12 months after every single person leaves prison, they will now be receiving support and supervision from the state. But it will be planned before they're out of prison. And up to now, it's just simply not been possible. And the reality is, it's been a very disparate situation. So we have been releasing people into London, for example, from more than 100 prisons around the country. And there was no way that would ever conducive to having some kind of proper planning for release and continuity of support. That will now change with these reforms. The network of resettlement prisoners will iron out this phenomenon. Of course, all of this reform has been going on against a background of tough constraints, with an ageing Victorian-era prison estate that we are step-by-step seeking to change and modernise, and of course that overarching dire financial situation that I touched upon at the start. So what's the approach been to the management of the prison estate? Well, when I took over, I inherited a plan from Ken that involved privatising 9 prisons and then going on to privatise step-by-step the whole prison estate. I gave this plan very careful consideration, and I decided, probably slightly counterintuitively, really, since I'm the right-wing Conservative here, not to go down the route of privatisation. Instead, I listened to our workforce, to the prison governors, to the prison unions, and judged that the best way of meeting the financial challenge that we faced, keeping a close working partnership with our staff, was to listen to that advice, to work with them, and to deliver what they had recommended as an alternative, which is called benchmarking. What benchmarking actually involves means looking at the whole prison estate, means finding where things work most efficiently, involves spreading that knowledge and practice and ways of working across all prisons. It's meant the streamlining of management layers, changes to ways of working, and yes, some operational staff reductions. But it's been done working to a template designed by my own staff teams, and they continue to tell me that it is workable. It's been a difficult period of change, but it's been a change that's been essential given the reality of our budgets. And yes, there have been additional pressures over the last 18 months that come from other factors apart from simply the reshaping of our system. And of course, it's difficult when those pressures arise during a period of change. And what I want to do today is to put on record how grateful I am to all prison staff for the very good work that they do around the prison system, dealing with some very awkward people, dealing with some big challenges, dealing with change. I'm immensely grateful for them. They do a great job for us that is often invisible down in the sun. But actually, there have been other challenges that have appeared as well. The first has been an unexpected turnaround in the trends in our courts, particularly with regard to sex offences. Aftermath of the Savile revelations, the aftermath of the dreadful events that we've seen in places like Rotherham and Oxford with child sex abuse, have led to a substantial increase in the number of sex offenders in our courts. You talk to any judge, they will say it's taking up a huge part of their time at the moment. More have been arriving in our prisons, and of course they're getting sentenced for longer periods than might have been the case in the past. So from a point where we were seeing a steady decline in the prison population, we've had to adapt pretty quickly to a turnaround and a sudden move back up in the prison population. And that's come at a time when there have been significant staff shortages, particularly in the southeast, where we've seen a buoyant labour market and staff tempted away often to better private sector jobs. It is frustrating and it may be gratifying to the point of knowing that our economic policies are working, but it does cause real issues within the system. And it leaves pressure on individual prisoners. So yes, we have had some prisoners operating on restricted regimes and some prisoners locked up for longer than we could wish. But we are also in the process of recruiting 1,700 more prison officers, and those pressures are easing. again, I'm very grateful to the staff who have coped with those pressures during a difficult period. So I said, yeah, clearly, yes, we do need some more staff in our state, but I also want to address head-on another issue that over the last few months has gained traction among critics. Be very clear, prison overcrowding today is close to a 10-year low, with far fewer prisoners sharing a cell than has been the case in the past. Now I want to turn to two other major questions: the increase in the rate of self-inflicted deaths and increased levels of violence. We have looked very carefully at why we've seen that increase in suicides. It was particularly acute in the later months of 2013 and early 2014. Staff across norms are working incredibly hard to keep the number of deaths as low as possible. The figures are fluctuating quite sharply. I'm personally keeping a close eye on this issue. And let's be clear, any self-inflicted death in prison is one too many. But I reject the idea put forward, particularly by left-wing pressure groups, in a very strident way, that it is budget cuts by government that are causing this problem. I reject that. We have looked at the incidence of suicide across the prison estate. We have not found a correlation between suicide and either staff cutbacks or poor inspection of courts. We've seen serious self-harm in prisons where there have been no staff reductions. We've seen serious self-harm in prisons where there have been excellent inspection reports, as well as others where there have been much poor reports. In the cases I've looked at, the most common thread visible is around mental health. I've spoken on this subject before. I remain convinced it is a big challenge that we have to address in our criminal justice system. In the prison arena, it is now my biggest priority. We've made some good progress with the system of liaison and diversion at our police stations and courts to get people out of the criminal justice system and into treatment when needed. There is a lot of work taking place across government at the moment to bolster that work. And we have some incredibly dedicated staff in prisons working with some of the most difficult individuals in our prisons who are suffering from acute mental health problems and who often need around-the-clock supervision in isolation units. There is really good work being done. And often places, there was a lot of publicity about work in Scrubs having a challenging report recently. Within that report, there was high praise for the work being done by the team who specialise in mental health and who try to deal with mental health problems in that prison. I think that we need to take this work to the next level. My department, the Department of Health, are looking very closely at what we can do next to tackle the problem. In particular, I believe we may need to create more specialist centres in the prison estate to deal with mental health problems, in the way that we've already done with sex offenders, to concentrate the expertise we have in dealing with it. That's something we're looking at very actively now. And it's my intention that post-May, if I'm still doing the jobs I hope I will be, then that will become the big focus of how we deliver before it's necessary to step up to what we do in this area. Let me just touch on the other key pressure we're facing, increasing levels of violence in the prisons. Now, put this in context, actually the number of assaults in the prisons hasn't changed massively over the years. It fluctuates up and down year to year. Where there has been an increase, and a worrying increase in the number of serious assaults on staff. Part of the reason is that we're having more people convicted of serious violent crimes going to prison today than was perhaps the case 10 or 20 years ago. In London, gang-related violence often just moves with disagreements and confrontations in the street, inside our prison with rail marks. But amongst all that, there is a new phenomenon there is a growing consensus that we also have a big problem with the growing phenomenon of a new generation of what are called legal highs, we call them new psychoactive substances. They are a significant problem for our society generally. Drugs have always been a problem in our prison, but hard work over years has brought down the level of positive tests from 25% to around 7%. But you go onto any prison wing, and staff will tell you that whilst we've made good headway on traditional drugs like heroin and cannabis, the new challenge for those synthetic highs, those new psychoactive substances. Unlike the effects of, say, cannabis, the anecdotal evidence certainly seems to be that these new drugs are incredibly disruptive, causing prisons to lash out and contributing, at least in part, to the incidents of violence that we have seen. Last week I was speaking to police in the West Country about their experience of those drugs in the community, and they say they have a really dramatic effect on those who take them. They lash out, they don't feel pain, and it takes more officers to restrain them. We are facing a challenge with the use use of those drugs in our prisons, and stamping out their use is a major priority for us. As Ed said, over the weekend, I outlined new steps that we're taking to make it absolutely clear to both prisoners and their suppliers, whether inside or outside the prison gate, that we will have an absolutely zero tolerance towards this kind of contraband too. If you're caught abusing drugs or smuggling them in, the penalties can be severe, and we will take all measures we can to crack down on this. It's not easy, it's a big battle, but we will work very hard to crack down on this. And I'm absolutely convinced that the arrival of MPS is a central part of the challenge we face in our prisons. They are, as I say, causing major problems out in the community, causing people to lash out in a way they wouldn't have done in the past. And those in social services who I've spoken to as well about this say they're causing self-harm in the community as well. We know some of these drugs getting into our prisons. I believe they are causing the same effects among inmates, and that's why tackling the problem robustly is so important. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I tried here to set out a realistic appraisal of where we are in our prisons policy, where we think we should be heading. I'm complacent about none of the challenges that lie ahead. If anything, they're going to only become more acute as we continue to deal with the fallout of the economic challenges that we've faced for the last 5 years and the changing nature of the profile of offenders that we have in our care. My team and I are realistic about the bumpy road ahead, but whatever obstacles there may be, I remain absolutely committed to the reforms, to the rehabilitation of offenders that start next week, to continuing to drive the growth of work and education in our prisons, to make sure that tough but fair punishment is balanced by a real and proper effort to make sure those people do not come back again.